Okay, on to the third and final lecture for the day. And we're going to briefly talk about the powers of government. This section is really sort of a grab bag. There's a few terms and ideas that I need to make sure we all understand before we can really get into the meat of the course. So I put them at the end of this introductory lecture so we could talk about it. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is a general question of what should the government do? Now, I put down a couple of answers here, but really one of the best answers to that question comes from the U.S. Constitution, the preamble, the first little part. You might have memorized it apparently in high school, but I'll just read it to you real fast. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, basically what they did is they listed what powers they believe the new government should have. What is its purpose? So let's walk through them. Well, first off, they said form a more perfect union. Now, we'll talk about this next week or the following week when we talk about the founding of the United States. But one of the big issues at the founding was we had 13 independent colonies that became 13 independent states, and we created these Articles of Confederation in an attempt to get them to work together. But they weren't strong enough. So one of the big purposes of creating this new government was to create a more perfect union of these 13 independent states, 13 independent countries. Establish justice. Make sure that we are getting fair treatment, just behavior. Ensure domestic tranquility. Again, we saw throughout this early period of U.S. history the weaknesses of the central government leading to rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, and we'll talk about that more later. Provide for the common defense. That was a big one. The overwhelming fear of the founding fathers was that England would come back and take them, or maybe France this time, or one of the other powerful European countries would come in and conquer them. And so they wanted to join and create a single country so that they could defend themselves. Promote the general welfare. Make sure people are taken care of. The state is taken care of. Secure liberty for ourselves and our posterity. That's why they created it. So defense, making sure we're safe. Diplomacy, dealing with other nations. Police, making sure that our stuff is protected. And infrastructure, making sure we have roads, bridges, clean drinking water. Economic regulation. Now that's a questionable one. There's a lot of people who talk about that one. To what extent should the government regulate the economy, or should we just allow that invisible hand to control the economy? We'll talk about that at the very end of our course when we talk a little bit about economic policy. Now what about this one? Regulation of religion. Now in the U.S., we generally see that religion when we go, nope, that's not something we are interested in. We don't believe the government should do that. We believe in freedom of religion. But we are kind of an outlier in that. Throughout most of history, religion and state have gone hand in hand. The idea that the state controls religion, says what people's religions are, or even if they don't do that, says what kind of religions are acceptable. And so the idea of regulation of religion is a common one. We actually talked about it before. Remember, we talked about this when we dealt with the divine right of kings. If the king was chosen by God, then it's very important for the state to control people's beliefs in God. So you look in England, who's the head of the Church of England? The Queen of England. And so this idea that the government should have the power to control religion, we don't believe it in the U.S., but it is a very common power of governments across the world. Now, one idea you should be familiar with, but I have to make sure you are familiar with it, is the idea of separation of powers. We founded this country after a long and bloody war with someone we called an English tyrant, right? We didn't want to create a situation where we just had a new tyrant. And one of the ways we went about doing this is we said, government will work best if we take all those powers the king used to have and divide them up, not just to one person, but give those to 3 people. So we have a legislative branch that makes the laws. We have an executive branch which enforces the laws. And then we have a judicial branch which interprets and applies the laws. Now, ultimately, in the classical system, all of those resided with the king. All those powers came through the king. But we divided them up, and the idea was that the government would function best when all the power is not with a single person, but when it is divided out. Now, separation of powers leads naturally to the idea of checks and balances. Again, you should have heard about this, but I have to make sure we're all on the same page. We have three branches of government, all handling slightly different things, but all of them oversee an aspect of the other governments. So, the executive branch carries out the law, enforces the law, but he can also veto laws or sign bills into law that the legislative branch creates. So he has some control over the legislative process, although that's not the main job. Now, the judicial branch is the one that interprets and applies the laws, but the president appoints federal judges and can pardon federal offenders. So we see that he has some power over there. Similarly, the judicial branch works the same way. They can declare actions unconstitutional. So if the president does something wrong, the judicial branch gets to tell him that. They get to do the same thing for Congress. What about Congress? Well, Congress has the power when it comes to judges. They have the power of impeachment, the power to remove judges. They also, the Senate approves the president's appointment of judges, so they get to choose who serves as a judge. They get to override presidential vetoes. So if the president uses his power to say you can't pass this law, if enough congressmen disagree, they can go ahead and say, yeah, we're passing the law anyway. They ratify treaties, they declare war, and ultimately, and this is a big one, the legislative branch controls the money. They have what we call the power of the purse. So we'll go into all of these powers later, but it's important to understand we have three branches of government, and they all do something separate, but they all look over each other's shoulders and make sure nobody's doing anything wrong. And so by having these three branches, we've divided up the power, but we also create a tension between the three branches. They all work together, but they also kind of work against each other, making sure no single branch grows too powerful. Now, this is actually a huge concern right now because many people are saying that the executive branch, and this was before Trump, the executive branch was growing too powerful. And it certainly hasn't stopped under President Trump's interpretation of the executive power. This idea of the executive branch as being the leader in the legislative process. This idea of a president who is working with Congress to push through his own judicial nominees very quickly and sort of change the character of the judicial branch. So this checks and balances works, but it really only works for as long as all of the branches agree that they're going to do their job, and there's some concern over what's happening with that right now. Okay, so I promised you at the beginning that we would end by playing a little game. Basically, this is a series of thought exercises. I do this in class. I love doing this in class. Obviously, I can't do it here. So what I'm going to ask you to do, I normally will have them divide into groups, and we'll go through each one, and we'll talk about it. But obviously, we can't do it. So I'm going to pop up basically a little scenario for you. And I want you to look at it, read it, push pause, and think about it for a minute. And ask yourselves this question. What kind of government, looking at the information we've seen so far, how many people should be in charge? How are they chosen? What powers should they have? If I was in this situation, what kind of government should I create and why? And this is a big part of why I teach this course is I want you to think critically about your government. Don't just say, well, we have a representative democracy, therefore, with universal suffrage or near universal suffrage, therefore, that's the right answer. That's not how it works. Each government is derived from the needs and ideas of the people. And so different governments arise for different reasons, and there are different benefits. So I'm going to run through these, take a little bit of time, think about it, or just skip this. I mean, what am I going to do to you? But I hope you spend some time with it. So here we go. Scenario 1. Tomorrow morning, you wake up and you're on an alien planet with 2,000 people from your neighborhood. They hear, hey, you took Professor Wallace's government class. You must be really good at government. Why don't you go ahead and set up a government for us? So what kind of government are you going to create, and what kind of powers does it have? Now, go ahead and pause, take a few minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay, I wonder if you pause. But one way or another, we're back now. So what would you set up? What are your considerations here? Well, a lot of people say, well, let's set up a democracy. Now, why? Well, 2,000 people, that might work for a democracy, right? That's not a huge number of people. We might even be able to do a direct democracy, right? But there's other factors. Now, we're on an alien planet. What else is on the alien planet? We have no idea, right? We might need to respond quickly. We might need to do unpopular things to keep our government alive, to keep our people moving. So if you have a committee made up of 2,000 people all trying to make a decision, are you going to be able to quickly set up a society? Are you going to be able to tell people, go out and hunt that wild alien over there, hope he doesn't eat us? How are you going to get somebody to take the first bite of something that might be poisonous if everyone gets an equal vote? So maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want to set up, maybe instead of having a democracy, maybe you want to set up a monarchy in this situation. Maybe you want to say, you put me in charge, I'm in charge, I'm going to tell people what to do. Does that make sense? Or maybe a oligarchy. A lot of students, and I always like this idea, they say, let's pick people, let's pick a meritocracy oligarchy. Let's pick the best hunter, the best police officer, the best whoever, and put them all together. And then we'll have a government made up of that. Now, that can work great. It can also work horribly. We talk about this some in my Texas government class, and we talk about forms of municipal government, and one in particular. So there's a lot of answers here. It's an interesting question. What do you set up? You need a government that can quickly respond to crises, but you also have a relatively small group of relatively similar people, so you may be able to work some democratic angles. So it's an interesting one. So let's move on to scenario 2. So we're no longer on our alien planet. This time, a new island has appeared in the Pacific Ocean. The United Nations, and it's a big island. The United Nations has decided that they are going to pick 100,000 people from around the world, and they are going to settle them on this island as a new universal country. And they decide, hey, you did really well in that government class. You're in charge. What kind of government should you set up, and why? So go ahead, pause, take a couple of minutes. Okay, we are back yet again. So what kind of government did you set up? Well, it's an interesting question, right? So do we set up a democracy? I mean, that's the temptation, right? That's almost certainly what the UN would want you to do. But do we set up a democracy? Well, that could be difficult, right? See, in the first scenario, the alien planet, we all came from the same neighborhood. We all kind of had the same ideas, the same culture, the same background, the same expectations of government. So if we set up a democracy, we're generally going to see that we want the same things out of it, and we want the government to have some powers and not have others. But what about around the world? We see a wide variety of ideas of government around the world. Now, assuming this 100,000 was somewhat representative of the world population, it would be primarily South Asia, right? We'd see Chinese, Indian, different large representation from people in that region of the world. We'd see a large representation from people in Africa. We wouldn't see as many from the U.S. or as many from Europe. And so we'd see cultures that might have a very different view of what a government should do. So if we set up a democracy, we have to be ready for the idea that the democracy will look nothing like what we as Americans might expect the government to look like. But if you set up a monarchy, how's that going to work? It might be problematic. I've heard students say, well, we're going to set up a oligarchy, and we're basically going to pick one representative from each group, each country of origin, and let them come and sit on the council. And that sounds like a great idea until you realize what we just talked about. So you'll have, the one person from Canada will be on the council, and one person from China who's representing 1,000 people will be on the council. And this brings up an interesting question. Again, something we're going to deal with later in this course when we talk about setting up our own country. How do you set up a representative council among different groups with unequal representation? This was something our founding fathers dealt with. We had 13 colonies, which became 13 states. Each one had their own history and culture. And population. So, do we let the high population states overrule the low population states? Do we give everyone equal representation, even though it means that the low population states, each citizen has more voting rights? And so it's an interesting question and not an easy one. Now, at this point, some of you are probably yelling at your TV, what's the answer? What kind of government should we set up? And that's one of the great things about this course is there's not an answer. These are questions to get you thinking about government in a practical way. I'm not going to tell you, and the answer is junta. That's not how this course works. The question is what's important, getting you to think about it, because you'll come up with 1,000 answers, some of which are smarter than I'll ever come up with, and each of those has a practical application to help you understand how government should work. Now, final scenario for today. Scenario 3. Texas declares its independence. Yay! Independent Texas again. Republic's back. You are chosen to create the new government. What kind of government do you set up? Now, there's a lot of jokes about this one whenever I bring it up, but generally we move kind of quickly because everyone agrees a representative democracy. Now, why? Well, Texas has a very large population. However, it's a population of people with a shared history, shared culture, and shared idea of government. So that makes a really big difference. That's the huge difference between scenario 2 and scenario 3 is this shared identity. That really makes a big difference in what kind of government we should set up. What are the rules we can all agree to? And so scenario 3 is in many cases the easiest because we're just going to keep on doing what we do now. We're just going to get rid of the federal government. So it's a different perspective on this whole question. So the question we started out with was, does the level of establishment of an area affect the government? When you show up on an alien planet, you don't know where food is, you don't know where water is, does that make it different than Texas declaring its independence? Do frontiers need different governance than cities? In a frontier, do you maybe need more military control than you do in an educated urban center? Maybe. Does the population size change what happens? Smaller population, more likely we can be direct democracy, right? Less need for representation. But very large populations, it'll be really hard to get people together. And finally, what we talked about, cohesion of the citizens. If everyone agrees, you can generally set up a more robust government. But if everyone disagrees on what the roles of government are, it makes it a whole lot more difficult to set up a lasting form. So that's the end of the slideshow, but the takeaway I want you to take from this is I truly believe that when we're dealing with government, there's no one-size-fits-all answers. Government's not true-false. It's a thinking exercise. What works best in one area, what works best for one people, might not be the same thing that works best in another area. So throughout this course, we're going to be presented with a lot of thoughts and ideas, and I'm not trying to get you to repeat to me the answer that I gave you. I want you to think about it, think about these issues, and then realize there could be 1,000 potential answers, an infinite number of potential answers to this question of what government works best, and it's going to be up to you to decide which one works best for you. So thank you very much. That's the third and final lecture for this week. So I will ask that you go ahead and make sure you complete the quiz, and I'm also going to put up another forum with a question for you to come in and answer. So make sure you take care of both those so we can get you all the grades for this week. If you have any questions or if you think I should be doing something different with these slideshows, please go ahead and let me know. Shoot me an email or put it on the message board, whatever it is, and let me know so I can kind of take some feedback and see what we need to change. Okay, thank you very much.